I came from dancers, singers, poets, writers, artists, painters, carried sketchbooks on their travels, carried a song on their lips, held their babies and sang to them. It has to be, because how would I have all of this in me? I am not an anomaly. I come from a long line of creatives. It's in my blood. And jokers, pranksters, so much laughter and games to get through the hard times. We do what we have to do, and we try to do it with a smile on our face. People who lived through harsh winters, darkness, little food, cold, and chose that. For some reason, family, opportunity, promise. Probably the same way I do. My daughter has it in her now, too. She reminds me of my grandmother, who passed 2 years after her birth. She walks like her and smiles like her. And she even says things like her, the way that she did. I wonder if she comes through. I wish I had less inhibitions. I wish I talked to my dead more. I wish I had talked to them more when they were living, too. But I was young then. It's not really my fault. It's hard to fathom what it means to be with someone while they're still here. And it's hard to grasp what it means when they're gone. The untold stories. The things we'll never know. The nuance. Their dreams. And all the other things they held inside themselves. All the things I hold inside of me. I got photos from my mom of our first ancestors on the plains at their homestead in North Dakota. My mother used to read me Little House on the Prairie as a girl, and now I read it to my daughter, carrying on that tradition. But while reading it, I noticed that I needed to edit some of the words that are now considered slurs. It's interesting to see blatant racism and sexism in a story like this. Such dehumanizing language. Ma and the neighbor speak of how Indians, quote unquote, don't know what to do with good land. It belongs to those who will farm it. I think about this in the context of my own family members living that same way on a homestead. I found out on my dad's side, we've just been certified as having family who came over on the Mayflower. I looked into that story, and many on the Mayflower were Calvinists escaping religious persecution in England, and these were probably my family members from Scotland and Ireland. So Amsterdam was a very liberal place, and the Calvinists went there first, but what they found was it was too liberal for their taste. They settled in Leiden and closed off the border to everyone who wasn't as morally astute as they were. And then after 10 years, they boarded the Mayflower. The more I learn about the Thanksgiving myth, the more disturbing it becomes. In learning about my own heritage, I definitely feel a more solid responsibility here. There's a direct link in me to the colonizers. And it really wasn't about religious freedom. It was about religious control and opportunity to take land. I don't discount the suffering of half the pilgrims dying that first winter in Massachusetts, but suffering does not negate privilege. There is a necessary acknowledgement to the toll of human life suffered by the First Nations people here. We're talking 100 million and more in genocides as opposed to 50 deaths of pilgrims due to freezing or starvation. The same way my white Christian culture taught me to tithe 10 cents of each dollar back to the church, there is a necessary component of acknowledgement of the harm caused in order to make healing possible for the people here. And also reparations on a consistent individual level, like person-to-person tithing type situation, mutual aid, as well as pressure put on institutions to enact reparations on a system level as well. Knowing my own history reinforces that for me. I honor the labor and sacrifice, and I have deep respect for my ancestors in that, and I understand their want for a better life, but now I'm away from my ancestral homelands, deep in the woods of South Germany or the Czech Republic, near the sea in Denmark, on the mountains of the Highlands in Scotland, and I have disdain for my ancestors' overt racism, sexism, and violence toward others, which they have justified in the name of God. I grew up in the Christian church as a child and had to process and carry that. And finally, I'm unburdening myself of it and now taking up responsibility to my ancestors' legacy. And that feels like the right thing to do. My very being rejected puritanical dogma from the go. I didn't understand how love could be a sin when between two people of the same sex, regardless. Jesus taught love above all, or at least that's what they told me. For the first 13 years of my life, I attended and was schooled at a private, non-denominational, conservative, Republican, Christian church. I figured out how to be the best at all the assignments they gave to us, even when I laughed inside at the youth group volunteer who taught us how to speak in tongues with doubt in her eyes. I wanted to explore all the places they said were off limits. I wanted to be Eve, from the nakedness to the desire and the fall from grace. I felt the story was always missing nuance and the wonderful power I felt inside of me. I said I wanted to attend public school to become a missionary for Christ, but really I wanted to get out from under the enormous pressure of being responsible for the souls of everyone I ever met. Hell, though, was a motivating fear. I truly believed it. And in devils and demons, I thought they were real. I was terrified of becoming possessed in life and of being tortured eternally by them in death. It wasn't until I left the States at 22 that I began to understand the extent of my indoctrination and how it affected my relationship to myself and others. It took even longer to finally find a community that reflected the unspoken and sometimes intangible values within me, just waiting to feel safe enough to come out. Now I'm trying to make my way back to the family I have, bearing new gifts of the Spirit. In the beginning, the first time the sun shone on the moon was so surprised and so touched by the sun's bright beaming at her. She had never had anyone look at her before, and especially with such light, that she began to shine herself. It felt so good to be seen and to shine back, too, that she began to cry. The moon's tears fell down to the earth, and that became yin. The yin flowed across the earth, and when they bled, the earth bore fruit. The roots of the trees grew so deep and wide that they pushed the earth apart, and they moved so much in a day that out of the pressure a volcano erupted. When the lava flowed, the fiery liquid is what became yang. When yang met with yin, their children were the mix of fire and water, and built the continents. The blood of yin fertilized the land created by the fire yang, and the water of the earth fed the seeds. Of yin fertilized the land created by fire yang, and all the water of the earth fed the seeds. The children of yin and yang took hold of the earth's energies and began to make creatures with great ingenuity, diverse and wonderful beauty. While the animals held both fire and water energies, the volcano pressured the fire in the animals to be more powerful. All the while, the sea deeply called to them from below. Some animals grew larger and larger, and as they grew, their stomachs grew in size, and as their stomachs grew, so did their appetites, and through evolution, so did their teeth. They began eating other animals, and never felt full. Their teeth grew longer still, and they ate more and more animals, until one day there was nothing but birds left in the sky. Then that day the sharp-toothed animals with their hungry bellies began eating each other, until there was only one pack left of the closest family and friends. The strongest beast with the longest teeth tried not to continue his ravenous craze, but he felt it in his nature and couldn't stop himself from eating one of his children. The mother saw and cried, "Stop!" But it was too late. The beast recoiled in horror at what he had done and called to the others to follow him to the mountains to hunt for the rest of the birds. The mother went down into the fields and wept. She cried for so long that her tears filled the empty field. All the other mothers of the pack, who had been fed the animals their husbands killed, who had let it happen all this time for the sake of nature, or tradition, or necessity, saw what would become of their own families, and they gathered around the mother in the field in her grief. They all wept so that their tears swept over the barren ground of their once lush homeland. The fields turned to mud, and the mothers and their children were all swallowed up by the earth. The beasts who had been up in the mountains, successful in their kills, had the last of the birds in their mouths and came back to find their families disappeared. In desperate hunger, grief, rage, or all three, the great beasts all fought each other. The largest beast with the largest teeth and the largest stomach was all that remained of any living creature that day. When at last he had finished eating the bodies of his brothers, he lay upon the earth and rested, his belly still dissatisfied. Near his face, coming up out of the field, he noticed a small leaf. Beneath it he smelled something sweet, and he pulled up out of the earth a small, dense root. He had scoffed at the primitive animals and their rudimentary satisfaction with eating plants. After all, his teeth were proof of his superior evolution. He was sublimely gifted indeed to be armed. This was his birthright, to take flesh and feed his enormous stomach. And yet, he thought, the more he killed and ate, the larger his body and stomach seemed to grow, until he became so large that no one animal could fill his appetite, and still not even 2 or 3, let alone the stomachs of his family, which he killed for and fed, and the pack, and all the rest. The beast licked the root then, and he spat. The next day, without any alternative, and took up the root, and this time he ate it, leaves and all. He did not like the taste. He did not like the taste. He longed for the juicy meats of his former life, but in his hunger he searched for more roots. After they were gone, he realized that had he left them in the ground, they would grow larger and sweeter. He began to care for the leaves and took great pains to rotate and carefully harvest, as not to overglean, for it was a very long time to wait for new roots to grow. The beast lived this way, eating plants, and his body grew smaller, and his stomach shrank. Soon he only needed 3 roots per day, and he had grown them, a suitable size, but not too large that they lost their flavor. One day the sun dried the beast until his body turned to dust in the field of his carefully cultivated harvests, over the bodies of his loved ones, alone on the earth, with only the brilliant, flourishing plants. The moon full, I let go of your aching. My heart turned toward the light of my own desires. My mind a jumble, but still understanding the root cutting, and how time is linear, though I've moved on. I'm light speeds ahead on the track, I'm rounding corners with my insatiable desire for beauty, and there's life again to meet me. I'm here, thrown open the gates to my own secret garden of creation, full of fruits and animals. I give back to the earth as she nourishes me, saying, "Darling child, you're home." And I set up an easel to paint. I while away in my own gracious ecstasy, finally an atmosphere that suits my own inner feeling of appreciation, love, happy, carefree wonder, and capacity to give and wildly create.